Hi, I'm Gary Chartier from the Center for a Stateless Society. Welcome to ATP 101, an Introduction to Anarchism. This is Lecture 8. Is this how we get rid of the state? Probably not with a Vulcan EBF-25, but perhaps with another piece of hardware like this. Or do we want another option? That's the issue we're discussing today. The Tannehills ask, how do we get to a stateless society? They don't just say, push Rothbard's button or Leonard Read's, turn the state off. It's not that simple. And their approach takes into account, I think, the complexity, the challenging nature of making the transition to a stateless society happen. For instance, they think that currency reform is crucial. Now, they argue for a specific reform, the use of particular commodities to back money, rather than letting the market sort this out. And as I've already suggested, I think that's silly. But I think the currency reform makes sense. Why is currency reform a crucial part of getting rid of the state? Well, the answer, I think, is fairly straightforward. Because the state uses its ability to manipulate the money supply to fund projects it could never fund otherwise. That's why it might seem arcane and fairly narrow in focus to argue about whether we ought to, quote, end the Fed. But the reality is, without the ability to control the money supply that central banking makes possible, a state almost certainly could not do the things that most modern states do. In particular, certainly, it would be tough to make war. So, what else do the Tannehills argue for? So first of all, they think we need to end central banking, and that's surely right. They argue for abolishing taxes and moving instead to the use of user fees to support state activities. And there's also a discussion of job transitions, which is, I think, kind of amusing and certainly on target. The need for people who have been engaged in what we have to regard as parasitic work to move instead to productive work, to work that really will involve making a difference in ways that other people value rather than simply fulfilling roles that are mandated by the power elite. As the Tannehills note, people who do useful things are certainly going to be able to find work in a world without the state. People who do not so useful things, well, perhaps as they suggest, honest, honorable labor as janitors may be the only option for some folks who have gotten used to performing state-driven functions. Another thing they highlight is the importance of canceling government debt. And here their argument is that the people who contracted the debt are thugs, right? They contracted the debt at gunpoint, and it's not really fair for victims to be asked to pay debts contracted by thugs. Now, as a general principle, this is doubtless right, though obviously the people in many cases who accepted that arrangement and made loans to the state obviously did so in good faith. Some of them, obviously, the ones who benefited the most, were members of the power elite who were also in charge of the state. I think it's important to recognize that. But certainly there are some ordinary people who might not be thought of as co-conspirators with the state power centers, the operatives in those power centers. But in any event, I do wonder about the recommendation that people who expect Social Security benefits ought to be left to swing in the wind as the state is dismantled. It seems to me that these people deserve at least to get back the money taken from them by the thugs, and that ought to be fairly easy to determine. I also think that as a matter of what Charles Johnson has called strategic thickness, we need to think about this. If you haven't read Charles's wonderful article, Libertarianism Through Thick and Thin, or the parallel piece that incorporates some of the same material, Liberty, Equality, Solidarity toward a Dialectical Anarchism, you need to take a look at these pieces. What Charles argues, simply, is that if you're going to take seriously a commitment to peaceful cooperation, to non-aggression, there are other things you're going to have to take seriously for a range of reasons, even if those things aren't always necessarily directly entailed by a commitment to non-aggression, to peaceful cooperation. And one thing he mentions is the relevance of strategic thickness. That is, if you want to achieve the goal of ending institutionalized aggression, you're also going to have to do some other things which may not themselves be necessary, but certainly may have an important instrumental role to play in making it possible to end that institutionalized aggression. So the point here, I think, is that if some provision is not made for effective transition from the existing system of social provision, if some provision is not made for a transition without massive social dislocation, number one, if you get to a stateless society, that dislocation may lead to violence. And also, you may have trouble getting to that society because the support needed to ensure that the state isn't reestablished or that it's not disestablished in the first place may just not be forthcoming. So I think this is a strategic issue that really does need to be considered. More broadly, I think, when we talk about social security, it's important to think about the transition to a stateless society in terms of the state's impact on poverty. Now, here again, there is no better place to begin than the work of Charles Johnson, and I encourage you to Google his piece, Scratching By: How Government Creates Poverty as We Know It. You'll find a great deal of useful detail there that I encourage you to consider. But in any event, if you're going to transition away from the state, there's obviously going to be considerable concern on the part of some people that this means that somehow the economic security that the state is supposed to provide to people who are economically vulnerable may go out the window. And I think this is one of the most powerful and legitimate concerns that people have about ending the state and moving to a stateless society. I think clearly many of the functions that the state provides, functions like dispute resolution and conflict management, can certainly be provided more effectively by others. But you might ask about dealing with poverty. So I want to just make a few brief points here without references and just at the in a programmatic way that might help to illuminate the kind of response at least I'd want to make to this. One is that states don't treat recipients of their aid well. It's important to avoid comparing some idealized state practice with imaginary worst-case situations in a stateless society. If we look at what states actually do to the poor people who get money from them, we find that these people aren't served particularly well by the state, and the states routinely intrude into the lives of recipients of state assistance, violating people's privacy and seeking to regulate their behavior. The state's performance sets a very low standard. I mean, if all you're worried about is doing as well as the state doesn't do very well indeed here. It makes people's lives worse in many cases. It uses the fact that they receive benefits as an excuse